I'm about to tell you is a question that real scientists have asked in real laboratories, a question that sits at the very edge of what we know about time and life and the deep history of our planet. What if the first human beings, those early wanderers who looked up at the same stars you see tonight, what if they walked the earth at a time when something ancient still moved through the shadows of the forest? What if the last days of an age we thought was long overstretched closer to our own story than anyone had ever dared to imagine? Settle in. Let the weight of time carry you. We want to thank you for supporting us, and it would mean so much if you could support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing to help us keep this channel going. Anyways, back to the video. There is a number that scientists use sometimes when they talk about the end of the dinosaurs, and the number is 66 million years. 66 million years ago, a rock roughly 10 kilometers wide came screaming out of the darkness of space and hit the shallow sea that covered what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The impact released an amount of energy so staggering that geologists still argue about whether any word in the human language does it justice. The sky caught fire, the oceans boiled at the edges, a cloud of dust and debris so thick it blocked the sun rose into the atmosphere and spread across the entire planet. Within days, within hours in some directions. The world went dark, temperatures plummeted, photosynthesis stopped. The food chains that had sustained life on land for hundreds of millions of years collapsed from the bottom up, like a building whose foundation has been pulled out all at once. 66 million years! It is a number so large that it barely registers as real. Think about it this way. All of human history, everything that has ever been written down, every city ever built, every war ever fought, every song ever composed or story ever told, all of that spans roughly 5,000 years. Maybe 10,000 if you reach back to the very first villages, the very first crude drawings scratched into the walls of caves. 10,000 years against 66 million. That ratio is almost impossible to hold in your mind at once. 66 million years is 6,600 times longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. If you compressed all of human history into a single day, the extinction of the dinosaurs would have happened 6,600 days ago. That is more than 18 years. The dinosaurs ended 18 years before the first human being ever existed, if you compressed everything into that imaginary day. And yet, here is where the story gets genuinely strange. Here is where the comfortable distance between us and them starts to dissolve just a little, enough to feel like cold air moving through a crack in a door you thought was sealed. The non-avian dinosaurs, the ones that walked on land, the great sauropods and theropods and horned ceratopsians and armored ankylosaurs, yes, those ended 66 million years ago. That part is settled science. But the word dinosaur means something much larger and older and stranger than most people ever stop to consider. And the world that existed in the millions of years before that extinction, the world that led up to that final dark chapter, was not the world most of us picture when someone says the word prehistoric. It was not a world of pure fire and chaos, a world utterly alien and incomprehensible. Parts of it would have been familiar. Parts of it breathed and smelled and moved in ways that would have made a kind of instinctive sense to any creature that walked on two legs and looked at the horizon and wondered what was out there. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us begin where all good stories begin, at the beginning, or as close to it as we can get without losing our footing entirely. Let us begin by understanding the world as it existed in the late Cretaceous period, roughly 68 to 66 million years ago, in those last 2 million years before the asteroid came, because those 2 million years are important to our story. They tell us something about what the world looked, felt, smelled, and sounded like right before the curtain came down, and they tell us, in ways that will matter later, just how full that world still was. The late Cretaceous Earth was a planet in the middle of one of the most interesting chapters of its 4.5 billion year history. The supercontinent Pangaea had been breaking apart for roughly 180 million years by this point, and the continents were now arranged in configurations that were recognizably similar to today, though still distinctly different. North America existed as a recognizable landmass, but it was divided down the middle by a shallow inland sea called the Western Interior Seaway, a vast body of warm water that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico all the way north to what is now the Arctic Ocean. Picture North America, with a wide blue highway of sea running down its middle, splitting what would become the Great Plains into two separate landmasses. That sea was teeming with life. Ancient sharks and fish and long-necked marine reptiles called plesiosaurs hunted through its warm, shallow waters. Flying pterosaurs with wingspans of 10 meters or more soared above it, diving for fish. The climate of the late Cretaceous was dramatically warmer than today. There were no permanent ice caps at the poles. The Arctic and Antarctic regions were cold by the standards of the equatorial zones, certainly, but they were forested. You could have walked through conifer forests in what is now northern Alaska. Fossils of polar dinosaurs have been found there, creatures that lived year-round in high latitudes, enduring the long darkness of polar winters, huddling in groups perhaps, or migrating seasonally following the light. The idea of dinosaurs in a polar winter, moving through forests that today would be buried under permafrost, is one of those images that makes the ancient world feel simultaneously stranger and more vivid than we usually allow ourselves to imagine it. The vegetation of the late Cretaceous was in a state of remarkable transition. For most of the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, the dominant plant life on land had been the gymnosperms, conifers and cycads and tree ferns, ancient plants with no flowers, plants that reproduced through cones or spores, plants whose lineage stretched back hundreds of millions of years. But during the Cretaceous, something new was happening. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, had evolved. They appeared first in the fossil record around 130 million years ago, modest and experimental small flowering herbs and shrubs that seemed unlikely to challenge the ancient dominance of the cone-bearing forests. But they diversified with stunning speed. By the late Cretaceous, flowering plants were spreading across the landscape in a way that would, over the coming millions of years, completely transform the surface of the Earth. Picture the forests of the late Cretaceous as something caught between two ages. Vast stands of ancient conifers still dominated the higher latitudes, trees whose forms would have been familiar to a modern eye, firs and pines and redwoods, towering giants whose roots drew water from deep in the soil. But beneath them, and between them, in the warmer lowlands and along riverbanks and floodplains, the first flowering trees were beginning to appear. Magnolias, perhaps, their heavy white blossoms opening to the warm Cretaceous air. Ancient relatives of planes and poplars rustling at the edges of rivers. Vines climbing the lower trunks of conifers, reaching for sunlight. The world was in the middle of a floral revolution that would produce, over the following tens of millions of years, every fruit and flower and flowering tree on the planet today. And through all of it moved the dinosaurs. By the late Cretaceous, dinosaurs had been the dominant large animals on land for roughly 150 million years. That is a reign so long that it stretches comprehension. The entire span of time from the first dinosaurs to their extinction covers a period of roughly 165 million years. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. We are barely a rounding error in comparison. The dinosaurs had time to evolve and diversify, and go extinct within their own ranks, and be replaced by new lineages again and again, to fill every ecological niche available on land, to reach sizes that seem almost physically impossible, and then evolve smaller again, and then grow enormous a second time. By the end, they were extraordinary in their diversity. The most famous of the late Cretaceous dinosaurs was Tyrannosaurus rex, and the fame is deserved, because Tyrannosaurus was genuinely extraordinary. A fully grown adult stood roughly 4 meters tall at the hip and measured perhaps 12 to 13 meters from nose to tail. It weighed somewhere between 8 and 14 metric tons, depending on the individual and the estimate. Its skull alone was 1.5 meters long, lined with teeth designed not for slicing meat, but for crushing bone. Studies of T-Rex bite force suggest it could exert several thousand pounds of pressure per square inch, enough to shatter the thigh bones of the massive hadrosaurs and ceratopsians it hunted. Its vision was powerful and forward-facing, giving it binocular depth perception better than a modern hawk. Recent studies of its inner ear suggest it could hear low-frequency sounds over great distances, the kind of deep rumbles that carry through forests. But Tyrannosaurus was only one character in a vast and complex ecological drama. The hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, were probably the most abundant large herbivores in North America during the late Cretaceous. Edmontosaurus was one of the largest, reaching lengths of 12 meters or more, moving in herds across floodplains and along riverbanks, clipping vegetation with its broad, toothless beak and grinding it with hundreds of tightly packed cheek teeth arranged in batteries that could process enormous quantities of plant material. Evidence suggests these animals were vocal, that they produced complex sounds, perhaps through nasal structures that could be inflated or resonated. Picture herds of Edmontosaurus moving through those late Cretaceous forests in the way that elephant herds move today, with rumbles and calls and the constant sound of vegetation being pulled from the ground and chewed. The ceratopsians, horned dinosaurs, were equally impressive. Triceratops was among the last of them, a massive quadruped with a skull nearly 3 meters long, adorned with 2 long brow horns that could reach over 1 meter in length and a shorter nose horn, all framed by a bony frill at the back of the skull. Triceratops weighed somewhere between 6 and 12 tons. It may have moved in groups, at least for part of its life, though the evidence for truly herding behaviour in ceratopsians is still being debated. What we do know is that these animals were abundant in the last million years of the Cretaceous. Their remains are found in huge numbers across the Hell Creek Formation of North America, which preserves those final few 100,000 years before the asteroid. In some sites, Triceratops is the most commonly found large dinosaur, more common even than Tyrannosaurus. The armoured ankylosaurs and the plated stegosaurs, the long-necked sauropods in some regions, the small feathered theropods that scurried through the undergrowth, all of these were parts of a world so rich with large, strange, magnificent life that it is almost painful to contemplate its ending. Because that is the thing about the late Cretaceous that tends to get lost in the drama of the asteroid. In the years immediately before the impact, the dinosaurs were not in decline. They were not struggling. The ecosystem was not showing obvious signs of imminent collapse. Some researchers have argued that there were subtle signs of stress in the fossil record, some species declining, some ecosystems showing reduced diversity. But the broad picture is of a world that was working, a world that was full in a way that the world has never quite been since, at least not with those particular creatures. The skies were still inhabited by pterosaurs, those remarkable flying reptiles that had ruled the air since the Triassic and had evolved, by the late Cretaceous, into forms of almost absurd grandeur. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the largest known pterosaur, had a wingspan of roughly 10 to 11 meters, comparable to a small aircraft. When it stood on the ground, it was as tall as a giraffe. How a creature of that size actually flew is a question that still occupies the minds of biomechanics researchers. But fly it did, soaring on the warm updrafts above the late Cretaceous plains of North America, dipping down to snap up prey with its long, toothless beak. The oceans were equally spectacular. The western interior seaway was home to mosasaurs, giant marine lizards that had evolved from terrestrial ancestors sometime in the Middle Cretaceous and had, within a few tens of millions of years, diversified into some of the most formidable marine predators the world has ever seen. Mosasaurus hoffmanni, among the largest, reached lengths of perhaps 14 meters. It had massive jaws lined with conical teeth and a double-hinged jaw that could open wide enough to swallow prey whole. It was warm-blooded, or close to it, fast, agile, dominant. It patrolled the Cretaceous seas the way that great white sharks patrol modern oceans, as apex predators at the top of a rich marine food web. This was the world. Not 66 million years of distance and silence and empty rock. A world humming with life, with sound, with movement. A world in which the evenings would have sounded like nothing you've ever heard. A chorus of calls and rumbles and splashing water and the beat of enormous wings overhead. A world that was, in its own way, breathtakingly alive. And then, 66 million years ago, the sky lit up, and the long silence began. But our story does not end there. It does not even end with the extinction itself. Our story is about what came after, about the millions of years of aftermath and recovery, about the slow rebuilding of a world that had been shattered. And most of all, it is about a question that flickers at the edge of everything we know about that distant time, a question that feels impossible when you first hear it, and then, the more you sit with it, the more it refuses to be dismissed entirely. What if, somewhere in the vast and complicated story of recovery and change, and the slow emergence of new life forms over those 66 million years, what if the story of the last dinosaurs overlapped even briefly, even at the very thinnest edge of possibility, with the story of the first humans. Before we can understand what early humans might have seen, we need to spend a little more time in those last forests. We need to walk through them slowly, the way you walk through a place you know you're going to have to leave, noticing everything, wanting to carry it with you. Because the late Cretaceous forests were not what most popular images of the dinosaur age suggest. They were not tropical hellscapes of ferns and mud and sweltering heat under a blood-red sky. They were, in many ways, forests that a modern person would have found recognizable, not identical to the forests of today, not by a long stretch, but the same kinds of light, the same kinds of sound, the same fundamental experience of standing beneath tall trees and feeling the air move through the canopy above you. The late Cretaceous was, climatically speaking, a warm world. Global average temperatures were perhaps 8 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than today. There were no glaciers anywhere on the planet. Sea levels were significantly higher than now, which is why that inland sea cut through the middle of North America, and why large portions of what are now the interiors of continents were shallow marine environments. The poles were cold by equatorial standards, but temperate rather than frozen. And the tropics were genuinely hot, warm enough that the low-latitude regions close to the equator were some of the most productive ecosystems in the history of the planet. But the mid-latitudes, the regions that today would correspond to places like Western North America, Central Asia, Southern Europe, parts of Africa, these were places of remarkable richness, seasonal but never extreme. Warm summers that brought growth, milder winters that brought rain, the kinds of conditions that produced dense, layered, productive forests. And in the late Cretaceous, those forests were in the process of being transformed by the great flowering plant revolution that was slowly, century by century, reshaping the vegetative face of the earth. Imagine standing at the edge of one of those late Cretaceous forests in what would one day be Western North America, in that zone that today we call the Hell Creek Formation. The time is approximately 66.5 million years ago, 500,000 years before the asteroid. The air is warm and slightly humid. The smell is extraordinary, a thick, rich green smell of growing things, of decaying leaves, of standing water somewhere nearby, of resin from the conifers that still tower over much of the canopy. The light filters through in columns where the canopy opens, catching the particles of pollen drifting on the air, making them visible as tiny sparks of gold and white. The trees above you are a mixture of the old and the new. The conifers are the oldest presence here, massive sequoia-like trees whose trunks are wider than several people standing with linked arms. Their bark is reddish and deeply furrowed. Their crowns are far above, lost in a darkness of needles that filters the sky into something green and dim. But between the conifers, something newer is pushing through. Broad-leaved trees, early angiosperms, their leaves shaped in ways that look remarkably familiar. The kind of rounded, lobed, veined leaves that would not look out of place in a modern temperate forest. Some of them are in flower, small pale blossoms clustered at the branch tips. Nothing like the dramatic flowers that will evolve over the following tens of millions of years, but flowers nonetheless, real flowers. The first chapter of a story that will eventually produce every rose and orchid and dandelion on the modern earth. The understory beneath the canopy is dense. Ferns carpet the ground, true ferns, familiar ferns, the kind you would recognize immediately. Their fronds curl upward from the soil in tight spirals before opening into wide fans. Horsetails grow along the edges of the stream that runs through this section of forest, their segmented, jointed stems reaching a metre or more in height. The ground itself is thick with fallen needles and leaves, a deep soft carpet of organic matter that muffles your footsteps and releases a damp, earthy smell when you press into it. And there are insects. Everywhere. Insects. The late Cretaceous was as much an insect world as it was a dinosaur world, perhaps more so in terms of sheer abundance and diversity. Amber deposits from this period preserve insects in extraordinary detail, little windows into a world that is at once alien and completely familiar. There are ancient bees and wasps and beetles, the ancestors of modern forms, going about their ancient work in these ancient forests. There are flies in enormous variety. There are moths and butterflies in early forms, their wings not yet carrying the elaborate patterns of modern species but already recognizably what they are. And there are dragonflies, enormous ancient dragonflies, some with wingspans of 30 centimeters or more, hovering above the stream with that mechanical precision that makes dragonflies seem less like living things and more like the idea of living things made visible. The sounds of this forest would have been extraordinary. Scientists who study paleoecology and the acoustic environments of ancient worlds have tried to reconstruct what the Cretaceous soundscape might have been. The conclusion they tend to reach is that it would have been both familiar and deeply strange. Familiar because the fundamental physics of sound in a forested environment does not change very much. The way high frequencies get absorbed by foliage, the way low frequencies carry farther, the way the canopy creates a kind of acoustic ceiling. Strange because the specific sounds, the calls and signals of the animals that made this forest their home, would have been nothing like the sounds of any modern forest. Insects would have provided a constant background layer, a texture of buzzing and clicking and rasping, not entirely unlike the chorus of a modern summer forest, but shifted in its particular frequencies, different in its rhythms. Birds were present, real birds, the descendants of small feathered theropod dinosaurs, already occupying the forest canopy and singing songs that were the ancestors, in the most literal evolutionary sense, of every bird song in the world today. Those early Cretaceous birds would have sounded different from modern birds, their calls likely simpler, less elaborate. The complex vocal learning that produces the rich song of a modern thrush or warbler, still in the early stages of its evolutionary development. But they were there, and they were singing. And then there were the larger animals. The sounds of dinosaurs in a forest are genuinely one of the great unanswerable questions of paleontology. We know they communicated. We know this because communication is so fundamentally important to the survival of large animals, for mating, for warning, for maintaining group cohesion, that it is essentially universal among large vertebrates. The crest structures of some hadrosaurs, the elaborate tubes of bone built into their skulls, appear to have functioned as resonating chambers, capable of producing deep, haunting calls that would have carried for enormous distances through dense forest. Imagine a sound something like a very low foghorn, something like the call of a modern cassowary, but lower and richer and stranger, echoing through the columns of those conifer trunks, bouncing off the dense canopy above. The ceratopsians, animals like Triceratops, may have communicated through their frills, using colour changes and posture more than sound, the way many modern lizards do. But they were large enough that the sounds of their movement, the creak and crack of vegetation as they pushed through it, the deep vibration of their footsteps transmitted through the ground, would have registered as a kind of constant background presence. To be in a forest inhabited by Triceratops would have been to feel, through the soles of your feet, the faint tremor of several tons of animal moving nearby. And Tyrannosaurus. What did Tyrannosaurus sound like? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, but inference from related animals, from crocodilians and birds, which are the closest living relatives of dinosaurs, suggests something very different from the roar that popular culture has settled on. Crocodilians do not roar. They produce deep infrasonic bellows, vibrations so low in frequency that they are felt as much as heard, that can cause the water around a bellowing crocodile to dance and shiver. Large ground birds like emus and cassowaries produce booming resonant calls that carry for kilometers. A Tyrannosaurus may have communicated primarily in frequencies at or below the threshold of human hearing, enormous sub-bass vibrations that would have been felt rather than heard. The kind of sound that is not a sound at all, but a physical presence, a weight in the air, a tightening of something deep in the chest. This is the forest at the edge of the age of dinosaurs. Warm, green, humming with insect life, threaded with bird song and the deeper sounds of much larger animals moving through the undergrowth. The rivers that cross it are clear and quick, filled with fish, lined with the tracks of animals that come to drink. The sky visible through gaps in the canopy is blue and enormous, crossed occasionally by the vast shadow of a pterosaur on patrol. The ground underfoot is soft and alive, every square metre of it a miniature ecosystem of fungi and soil, invertebrates and the roots of plants. There is nothing about this world that is beyond imagining, nothing about it that requires a leap of abstraction so large that the mind refuses to make it. It was a real place, a real forest, with real air and real light and real sound. Animals lived in it, and died in it, and raised their young in it, and ate, and were eaten in it. The ordinary business of life, in all its complexity and brutality and beauty, was conducted in this forest exactly as it is conducted in every forest on Earth today. The only difference, the one difference that makes everything feel slightly tilted and strange, is the specific animals that move through it. 66.5 million years ago, those animals were Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus and Edmontosaurus and Ankylosaurus, and a dozen other species whose names most of us learned as children. 500,000 years later, they would all be gone, and the long work of rebuilding would begin, and out of that rebuilding eventually over immense spans of time would come something new, something warm and furred and clever, something that would stand upright on two legs and look at the horizon and wonder, something that one day would look at the bones of those ancient forests and try to understand what once walked there. But we are not there yet. Before we can ask what early humans might have seen, we must first understand what the world looked like in the millions of years after the extinction. We must understand the recovery, because it was in that recovery, in that long, slow, painful, miraculous rebuilding, that the conditions for our own existence were being laid down. And it is in understanding that recovery that we can begin, carefully and cautiously, to ask the question that forms the true heart of our story tonight. Sleep is beginning to soften the edges of thought now, perhaps. Let it. The story will still be here. The forest will still be waiting. Those columns of ancient light still falling through the gap in the canopy. The air still warm and green and full of sound. There is no hurry. We are moving through time slowly, the way time itself moves, one long breath at a time. Let the images settle. Let the sounds fade to a background murmur. The next part of the story will find you when you're ready. Here is something that tends to get lost in the way we tell the story of the end of the dinosaurs. The asteroid hit, the sky went dark, the temperatures crashed, and the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. All of that is true, but extinction, even catastrophic extinction, is rarely total. It is almost never an absolute line drawn across every form of life at once. The great extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago, was devastating beyond any easy comparison. It killed roughly 3/4 of all species on Earth. Marine ecosystems were shattered. Terrestrial food webs collapsed. The world was plunged into years of darkness and cold, years in which photosynthesis essentially stopped, in which the base of every food pyramid was pulled away, in which even the hardiest and most adaptable species faced conditions that seem almost impossible to survive. And yet, things did survive. The survivors are as interesting in their way as the creatures that were lost. Understanding who survived and why teaches us something profound about the nature of life, about what it takes to endure a catastrophe of planetary scale, about the strategies and shapes and sizes that turn out to matter when the world ends and has to begin again. The first and most important thing to understand is that the extinction was not instantaneous. The impact itself was instantaneous, of course. The moment of impact, the explosion, the fireball, the initial wave of destruction that radiated outward from the Yucatan Peninsula, that happened in seconds and minutes. But the global consequences unfolded over weeks and months and years and decades. The darkness from the ejected dust and soot from burning forests lasted years, perhaps a decade or more according to some models. The collapse of food webs took time to propagate through ecosystems, species that could hide, that could go dormant, that could survive on stored energy or on the dead organic matter that accumulated everywhere as living things died around them. Those species had time, not much time, but some. The survivors tended to be small. This is not a coincidence. Large animals require large amounts of food, which means they are disproportionately vulnerable when food becomes scarce. A Tyrannosaurus rex needed, by some estimates, several hundred kilograms of meat per week to maintain its enormous body. When the hadrosaur herds that fed it collapsed, when the ecosystem supporting those herds collapsed, Tyrannosaurus had nowhere to turn. It was too big to be flexible. Its energy requirements were too enormous to be met by the impoverished, simplified ecosystems that survived the immediate aftermath of the impact. Small animals face the same catastrophe with different arithmetic. A small shrew-sized mammal needs only a few grams of food per day. It can survive on seeds, on insects, on fungal material, on the roots of dead plants. It can burrow into the ground and go into a kind of torpor, slowing its metabolism to a fraction of its normal rate, surviving on stored fat. It can eat things that a Tyrannosaurus could not even recognize as food, and so it survives, huddled underground or in the crevices of rocks, while the great animals that dominated the surface world die around it. The mammals that survived the end Cretaceous extinction were small, very small. The largest mammal alive on Earth in the immediate aftermath of the impact was probably no bigger than a modern house cat. Most were considerably smaller. They were insectivores and omnivores, animals whose flexible diets had been an evolutionary luxury before the extinction and became an evolutionary superpower in the chaos afterward. Their small size, their burrowing habits, their tolerance for nutritional stress, all of these had been marginal advantages in a world dominated by giant dinosaurs. In the aftermath, they became the keys to survival. Birds survived too, which should remind us that the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs was not the extinction of all dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs, in the most precise and technical sense of the word. They are the living descendants of small feathered theropod dinosaurs, a lineage that diverged from the other theropods perhaps 150 million years ago. The birds that survived the end Cretaceous were the ground-dwelling seed-eating kinds, the birds that could scratch a living from the debris-covered earth in the years of darkness that followed. The forest canopy specialists, the birds that depended on the rich insect life of functioning forests, those mostly perished. But the generalists persisted, and from them, over the following tens of millions of years, all the birds in the world today descended. Crocodilians survived. This is one of the great underappreciated facts of natural history, that crocodiles and their relatives lived through the end Cretaceous extinction, with relatively modest losses compared to many other groups. The reasons are not entirely clear, but likely involve their semi-aquatic lifestyle, which gave them access to freshwater food sources that were less disrupted than terrestrial ones, and their ability to go for long periods without eating, a metabolic flexibility that is the envy of any large animal trying to survive a food shortage. Turtles survived. Snakes and lizards survived in reduced diversity. Frogs and salamanders survived, and in the oceans, though the marine extinction was in some ways even more devastating than the terrestrial one, sharks survived. Sharks are genuinely ancient, their basic body plan and ecological role essentially unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, and they made it through the end Cretaceous as they had made it through every other catastrophe in their long history, by being adaptable, by being able to eat almost anything, by being built for the long game rather than the good times. And so the world that emerged from the immediate aftermath of the extinction was impoverished but not empty. Imagine it as a canvas that has been mostly erased but not entirely. Some marks remain, some colours persist, and into the spaces left by what was lost, new things began to grow slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, then with the unstoppable energy of life filling a vacuum. The first few million years of the Paleogene period, the era that began the moment the Cretaceous ended, were a time of rebuilding. Forests regrew from their roots and seeds, the surviving plants expanding their ranges, new plant communities assembling themselves from whatever ingredients had made it through. The insects diversified rapidly, as they always do, their short generation times and vast numbers allowing evolutionary change at a pace that larger animals cannot match. And the mammals, those small surviving mammals, they did something extraordinary. They radiated. Radiation is the word biologists use when a single ancestral group diversifies rapidly into a wide variety of new forms, filling ecological roles that were previously occupied by other animals. The early Paleogene mammal radiation is one of the most dramatic evolutionary events in the history of animal life. Within a few million years of the extinction event, mammals had evolved into an enormous range of new body sizes and shapes and diets. From the tiny shrew-like insectivores that survived the impact, lineages emerged that would become herbivores and carnivores, runners and swimmers, tree climbers and burrowers, animals of every size from mouse to horse. But here is the crucial point for our story, the point that will matter when we get to the question of humans and dinosaurs, and that strange sliver of overlap that may or may not have existed. 66 million years is a very long time. The recovery from the end Cretaceous extinction, the radiation of mammals and birds into the empty ecological spaces, The rebuilding of functioning ecosystems, the cooling of the climate over millions of years toward the world we know today, all of this happened over timescales that dwarf anything in human experience. By the time the first true primates appeared, tens of millions of years had passed. By the time the first hominins, the ancestors of humans, appeared in Africa, it had been over 63 million years since the last non-avian dinosaur walked the earth. And by the time the first anatomically modern humans appeared, roughly 300,000 years ago, the dinosaurs had been gone for 65,700,000 years. The mathematics seemed to settle the question definitively. There is no overlap. There cannot be an overlap. The gap is too enormous, measured in a unit of time that makes everything in human history look like a single afternoon. And yet, the question persists, and it persists not because of any evidence that directly contradicts the established timeline, but because of something more subtle and more interesting. It persists because the world is complicated, because the fossil record is incomplete, because there are animals alive today that were once thought to have been extinct for much longer than we believed, and because the history of paleontology is littered with surprises, with discoveries that forced revisions of timelines and assumptions that had seemed settled. There is a concept in biology called a relict population. A relict is a surviving remnant of a once widespread lineage, a small isolated population that has persisted in some corner of the world long after its relatives disappeared everywhere else. Relict populations are real, they happen. The coelacanth, a fish once believed to have gone extinct along with the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, was discovered alive in 1938 off the coast of South Africa. The discovery sent shockwaves through the biological community. A fish that lived through the end Cretaceous extinction, that had been swimming in the deep ocean essentially unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, right under the noses of human civilization, entirely unknown to science until the 20th century. If a fish could survive unseen for 66 million years, what else might have? The answer, almost certainly, is nothing as large or dramatic as a non-avian dinosaur. The coelacanth is a deep-sea fish. It lives in environments that are almost inaccessible to human observation. Large land animals, even large marine animals near the surface, would be much harder to hide from a world increasingly full of observant primates spreading across every continent. But the question of what persisted, what survived in small numbers in isolated places, what walked or swam or flew through a world that was slowly over millions of years becoming the world we know, is not a simple question. It is not a question with a clean and final answer. And so we find ourselves in the quiet of this particular night, with this particular question floating in the space between wakefulness and sleep. What did the early humans see? What walked through the edges of their world? The forests they moved through were not our forests. The animals that shared those forests with them were not our animals. The earth they lived on was a planet in a particular moment of its very long history, a moment when some things that we think of as ancient were still present, and other things that we take for granted had not yet arrived. We will follow them into those forests now. We will walk with them, quietly, at the pace that allows you to notice things. The story has further to go yet. Let us now turn to the humans. Let us set aside for a moment the enormity of geological time and the mathematics of extinction, and instead find our way to something smaller and warmer and closer. Let us find the humans. Because before we can ask what they might have seen or encountered in a world that was still in many ways wild and ancient beyond imagining, we need to understand who they were and what their lives were like, and how they moved through the world they had inherited. The story of human evolution is long and complicated and still being written, with new discoveries revising our understanding almost every year. But the broad outline is something like this. The hominins, the group of primates that includes modern humans and all of our extinct relatives since our lineage diverged from that of chimpanzees, first appeared in Africa roughly 6 to 7 million years ago. Over the following millions of years, a succession of species evolved and diversified, each one exploring slightly different strategies for bipedal locomotion, for brain development, for tool use, for social organization. The Australopithecines, creatures like the famous Lucy, whose skeleton was discovered in Ethiopia in 1974, were walking upright 3 to 4 million years ago, their brains still ape-sized but their bodies already committed to the two-legged gait that would eventually carry our descendants to the moon. The genus Homo, our own genus, appeared roughly 2.5 million years ago, and over the following millions of years it diversified into a remarkable number of species, some of which existed simultaneously, some of which overlapped and interbred in ways that modern genetic analysis is only beginning to untangle. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, the tiny insular species from the island of Flores in Indonesia whose remains were discovered in 2003, and who may have survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago. The family tree of human evolution is not a single trunk growing upward toward us. It is a bush, branching and interweaving with many lines ending in silence and only one, our own, still growing. Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens in the full modern sense, appear in the fossil record of Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. But for most of those 300,000 years, we were not the only humans on the planet. Neanderthals inhabited Europe and Western Asia until roughly 40,000 years ago. The Denisovans, whose existence we know primarily from genetic traces in the DNA of modern people across Asia and the Pacific, were present in Siberia and possibly much of Asia until perhaps 50,000 years ago. And for tens of thousands of years, modern humans and these other human species overlapped, interacted, and occasionally interbred, leaving genetic echoes that still resonate in us today. The world that early modern humans inhabited from roughly 200,000 years ago to perhaps 50,000 years ago was a world in the grip of the Pleistocene epoch. The Pleistocene is the geological epoch defined by repeated glacial cycles, by ice ages that locked up enormous volumes of water in continental ice sheets and lowered sea levels by over 100 meters, changing the shapes of continents, connecting islands to mainlands, creating land bridges that animals and people walked across. It is the epoch of the woolly mammoth and the saber-toothed cat and the cave bear, of glaciers grinding their way across the northern continents and retreating again in cycles that lasted tens of thousands of years. Africa, where modern humans evolved, was not glaciated in the same way that Europe and North America were. It experienced its own climatic cycles, alternating between periods of wet, forested conditions and dry, open savanna conditions, between times when the Sahara was a green and habitable landscape, and times when it was the vast sand desert it is today. These climatic oscillations shaped the trajectory of human evolution profoundly, driving populations apart during dry periods when the landscape became fragmented and bringing them together during wet periods when forest corridors reconnected isolated refuges. The Africa of early modern humans was a place of extraordinary biological richness by any measure, except the one that compares it to the deep past. The megafauna, the large animals, was still largely intact. The Pleistocene extinction of the world's great beasts had not yet really begun in Africa, or at least not with the ferocity it would show elsewhere. Elephants and hippos, lions and leopards, giraffes and rhinoceroses, the enormous buffalo-like synchorus, giant tortoises in some regions, the extraordinary diversity of antelopes and gazelles, all of this was present and functioning, a world of large animals going about their business in an Africa that was, in some fundamental sense, more alive than the Africa of today. And into this world the early humans moved. They moved not as conquerors, not yet, not with the technological leverage that would eventually allow modern humans to reshape entire continents. They moved as one large primate among many, a species that was clever and adaptable and social, that made tools and communicated in complex language, and organized itself into groups that hunted and gathered across territories of considerable size, but a species that was still embedded in its ecosystem rather than standing outside it and directing it. These early humans were intimately familiar with the animals around them. Their survival depended on that familiarity. They needed to know which animals were dangerous and how dangerous, which were prey, and how to approach them, which were competitors for food, and how to avoid or deal with that competition. They needed to know the movements of herds across the landscape, the seasonal patterns that brought large animals to predictable places at predictable times. They watched animals with a focus and intensity that most modern humans never bring to the natural world. Their attention was the attention of someone for whom accurate observation could be the difference between eating and not eating, between surviving and not surviving. This is the context in which we need to place the question of what early humans saw. They were not casual observers. They were not people who noticed an unusual animal in passing and moved on without registering it. They were people whose entire relationship with the world was built around the careful observation and interpretation of the natural world, whose cultural transmission included detailed knowledge of the animals in their environment, passed from generation to generation through story and demonstration and practical instruction. What they saw, they noticed. What they noticed, they remembered and transmitted. What they transmitted became part of the collective knowledge of the group. Modern humans left Africa in waves, beginning perhaps 60 to 70,000 years ago, following routes that took them along the coast of southern Asia and eventually to Australia, into Europe, across Central Asia, and eventually across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. This diaspora took tens of thousands of years and brought modern humans into contact with environments and animal assemblages that no human or human ancestor had ever encountered before. The megafauna of Australia, isolated for tens of millions of years, evolved in ignorance of anything resembling a human being. The same was true of the animals of Europe, at least those that had not encountered Neanderthals, and of the Americas, where the fauna had evolved in isolation for millions of years. When modern humans arrived in these places, they encountered animals that had no fear of them, animals that had no evolved response to a bipedal ape with a spear. The consequences were dramatic and, from the perspective of the megafauna, catastrophic. The pattern of large animal extinction that followed the arrival of modern humans in region after region, from Australia to North America to the islands of the Pacific, is one of the most compelling and disturbing stories in natural history. We were, as a species, extraordinarily effective hunters. We arrived in new places with a full complement of social coordination, long-distance weapons, fire, and the accumulated tactical knowledge of tens of thousands of years of hunting experience. The animals we encountered had none of the behavioral adaptations that evolve in prey species over millennia of coexistence with a sophisticated predator. The result was, in many places, rapid and nearly total extinction of the large fauna. But not everywhere, and not all at once. Africa retained much of its megafauna precisely because the animals there had co-evolved with humans, had developed, over millions of years of coexistence with our ancestors, the wariness and behavioral flexibility that made survival alongside us possible. The elephant knows to fear the Maasai. The lion has learned what a human spear means. These are not genetic adaptations in most cases, but cultural ones, knowledge passed through animal populations over generations, learned responses to a threat that has been present for so long that it has become part of the landscape. What does all of this have to do with dinosaurs? Everything and nothing. It has nothing to do with the established timeline, which places the last non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years before the first humans, but it has everything to do with the texture of the world that early humans actually lived in, with the nature of the natural world they were embedded in, with the kind of encountering and noticing and wondering that would have characterized their relationship with the living things around them. When we ask what early humans might have seen, we're asking a question about attention and memory and transmission and the very human habit of making stories from what we observe. That habit is as old as our species, older probably, and it interacts in ways both obvious and subtle with the question of what the world actually contained. There is one more thing to say in this act before we move on. The world that early humans moved through was, as we have said, rich with large and often extraordinary animals. The megafauna of the Pleistocene was not composed of small, cautious creatures. It included things that would stop you in your tracks, things that would lodge themselves permanently in the memory of anyone who saw them. The woolly mammoth, a creature 4 meters tall at the shoulder, its great curved tusks sweeping forward and up from a massive skull, covered in reddish-brown hair, moving across the tundra in groups. The giant ground sloth of South America, some species of which reach the size of modern elephants, a creature so enormous and strange that it looks like something from a dream. The cave lion of Europe and Asia, perhaps the largest lion that has ever lived, its skeleton suggesting an animal 30% larger than the biggest modern African lion. These were real animals that real people saw. They saw them and were moved by them, terrified by them, fed by them, and they made stories about them that we can only partially recover from paintings on cave walls and fragments of bone carved into figures. The world of early human experience was a world of large and formidable animals in a way that the world today simply is not. And in that world, The capacity for wonder and for story-making in response to what was seen was not limited by what we now consider biologically plausible. It was shaped entirely by what was actually there. What was there determined what was seen. What was seen determined what was told, and what was told persisted in ways that often outlasted even the clearest memories of what originally inspired it. Now let's get specific. Now let us move out of the broad sweep of geological time and the theoretical framework of extinction and recovery, and find ourselves in something smaller and more immediate. Let us find ourselves in a particular moment, in a particular place, and ask what a particular pair of human eyes might have seen. The time is roughly 200,000 years ago. We are in Eastern Africa, in the region that today would correspond to the Ethiopian highlands, or the Rift Valley of Kenya and Tanzania. The climate is in one of its wetter phases. The landscape is not the open savanna that popular imagination tends to place early humans in, but something more varied and complex, a mosaic of grassland and woodland and dense riverine forest, with highland areas where the vegetation thickens into genuine montane forest. The rainy season has recently ended. The air smells of wet grass and distant flowers. The sky is very blue and very large. A group of perhaps 20 to 30 people is moving across this landscape, following a river that runs eastward toward lower ground. They carry spears and digging tools, and they move with the easy efficiency of people who have been walking long distances since childhood. The children are old enough to keep pace, the youngest carried on the back of an adult. They are not hurrying. They stop frequently to dig for roots, to collect the ripening fruit from a thorny tree, to watch something in the distance with the focused, evaluative attention of people who know that what is in the distance matters. What are they watching? A herd of some kind, large animals moving along the far side of the river. From this distance, the individual animals are too small to identify with certainty. They are herbivores, probably, their movement unhurried. The way the movement of a herd grazing in a rich landscape has an unhurried quality to it, a diffuse spreading and reforming that is different from the directed movement of animals that are going somewhere or fleeing from something. The watchers observe for a few minutes, cataloguing what they see. How many animals, how large, how close to the water. Then they move on. Now shift the scene forward by 100,000 years. We are on a different continent entirely, in what will one day be southern Europe, in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains or the ranges of what is now southern France. The time is roughly 100,000 years ago, and we are with Neanderthals, not yet with anatomically modern humans who have not yet arrived in this part of the world, but with our closest evolutionary relatives, intelligent social beings who have been living in these mountains for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals of this region lived alongside one of the most remarkable assemblages of large animals in the history of the world. Woolly mammoths, giant cave bears, cave hyenas, horses, aurochs, the massive ancestral cattle that were the ancestors of modern domestic cattle, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, cave lions, giant deer with antlers spanning 3.5 meters. And in some areas, at the edges of what remained of warmer climates, perhaps surviving relics of lineages that our usual model suggests should have been long gone. The cave paintings of southern France and northern Spain, the extraordinary art created by both Neanderthals and early modern humans in the period between roughly 40,000 and 12,000 years ago, preserve something of what those people saw. The animals depicted are done with astonishing accuracy and vividness. The aurochs painted in the caves of Lascaux are anatomically precise, their postures and movements captured with an understanding of animal behaviour that speaks to thousands of hours of careful observation. The horses are recognisable. The bison are unmistakable. The people who made these images were not producing stylized symbols. They were recording what they saw, with fidelity and care and an artistic skill that still takes the breath away 30,000 years later. But here is something interesting about those cave paintings. Among the animals depicted are some that are less easy to identify with certainty, some figures that do not map neatly onto any animal we know from the Pleistocene fauna, some shapes that have inspired debates among paleontologists and art historians about exactly what the artist intended to represent. Were these imagined creatures, mythological animals with no basis in observed reality, or were some of them accurate depictions of animals that the artist actually saw? Animals that have not yet been identified in the fossil record of the region, animals whose existence was real, but whose bones have not survived to be found. This is not a question with a definitive answer. The honest position is one of uncertainty, but the question itself is worth holding because it opens a window onto something important about the relationship between human observation and our scientific understanding of the ancient world. Our scientific understanding of what animals existed in any given region at any given time is based entirely on the fossil record, and the fossil record, however rich and detailed it may seem, is a tiny fraction of the actual history of life. The vast majority of animals that have ever lived have left no fossils. The circumstances required for fossilization, rapid burial in anoxic conditions that prevent decay, subsequent mineralization under exactly the right chemical conditions, subsequent preservation without being destroyed by tectonic activity or erosion, are rare. Most animals simply die and disappear. This means that the absence of a fossil record for a particular animal in a particular time and place cannot be taken as definitive proof that the animal was not present. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the philosophical cliché goes. It is simply evidence that the conditions for fossilization did not apply to that animal in that place. A small population of a large animal, living in an environment that does not favor fossilization, could have existed and disappeared without leaving a single bone that a scientist would ever find. Now, what does any of this have to do with dinosaurs specifically? The conventional answer, the scientifically defensible answer, is that none of it has anything to do with dinosaurs specifically. The 66 million year gap between the last non-avian dinosaurs and the first humans is not a gap that any reasonable scientific argument can close. Even the most incomplete fossil record, even accounting for every conceivable bias and gap and limitation, does not suggest that any non-avian dinosaur lineage could have survived for 66 million years without leaving any trace in the geological record. The chemistry and physics of the world would have changed too much. The environments that supported non-avian dinosaurs would have shifted too dramatically. The probability is vanishingly small, so small as to be, for all practical purposes, zero. But here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, where the science and the imagination and the deep human habit of wondering about the boundaries of what is possible come together in a way that is worth exploring, worth sitting with in the quiet of a sleepless or nearly sleeping night. The question of what early humans saw is not only a question about whether non-avian dinosaurs were present. It is also a question about what creatures, both living and recently extinct, presented themselves to early human observers as something dramatic enough to leave a mark on memory and story. Consider the large reptiles of Africa and Asia, and the Americas that were alive during the Pleistocene and into the Holocene, the epoch we currently live in. The Nile crocodile, the saltwater crocodile of the Indo-Pacific, creatures that can grow to lengths of 6 or 7 meters, that have been present in their current form for millions of years, that are, in the most literal sense, living dinosaur relatives. Their lineage diverging from the dinosaur line in the Triassic, but never going extinct as the dinosaurs did. A large Nile crocodile lying on a riverbank is not a small or subtle thing. It is an animal of genuine ancient power, a survivor of worlds that ended before the first human being drew breath. Consider the giant tortoises of the Galapagos and Aldabra, and the extinct giant tortoises that once inhabited many other oceanic islands, some of which survived until historical times. The Rodriguez giant tortoise, native to the island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean, was not hunted to extinction until the 18th century. Some of the Pacific Island giant tortoises may have survived even later. These were animals that could weigh 300 kilograms, that lived for well over a century, that moved through their island environments with the unhurried confidence of creatures that had no natural predators. An early human encountering a giant tortoise for the first time, in an environment where such encounters were novel, would have been seeing something genuinely extraordinary. Consider the Komodo dragon, the largest living lizard, which can grow to 3 meters in length and which hunts by ambush, using a combination of bacteria-laden saliva and venom to incapacitate prey as large as water buffalo. The Komodo dragon exists today on a handful of Indonesian islands, but closely related giant varanid lizards, now extinct, existed across Australia and Southeast Asia into relatively recent times. Megalania prisca, an extinct giant monitor lizard that lived in Australia until perhaps 45,000 years ago, possibly much more recently, reached lengths of perhaps 5 to 7 meters and weighed over 300 kilograms. It was unambiguously a large and dangerous reptile, and it coexisted with the first Australians. The first Australians saw megalania. We know this because the arrival of humans in Australia roughly 65,000 years ago correlates with the extinction of the Australian megafauna, including megalania. The people who arrived in Australia saw something that was by any everyday measure a monster, a cold-blooded, scale-covered, ambush-hunting reptile of enormous size, and they carried that experience, or something based on it, through their culture and their stories. Aboriginal Australian mythology includes figures that scholars have sometimes compared to large reptiles or dinosaur-like creatures. The bunyip of Australian legend is a water-dwelling creature of formidable size and terrifying aspect. The muljawunk of the Murray River is described in some accounts as a creature of reptilian character. How much of this mythology preserves a genuine ancient memory of actual encounters with megalania or other large extinct reptiles, and how much is pure mythology with no zoological referent, is genuinely impossible to say with scientific certainty. But the question is not absurd. Human memory, transmitted through culture, is longer than most people realise. There is a remarkable body of research, still growing and still controversial in some of its conclusions, that suggests Aboriginal Australian oral tradition preserves accurate information about events that occurred thousands of years ago. Sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, 12 to 15,000 years ago, flooded enormous areas of coastline around Australia. Stories in Aboriginal oral tradition from coastal communities describe the flooding of lands that are now under the sea, describing specific geographical features of drowned landscapes with an accuracy that has only been verified by modern marine surveys. These stories, if their accuracy is genuine and not coincidental, represent cultural memory persisting across hundreds of generations, across timescales of 12 to 15,000 years, without being reduced to mere metaphor or losing their geographical specificity. If human cultural memory can preserve accurate information across 12,000 years, what might it preserve across 60 or 100,000 years? The honest answer is that we do not know. The evidence for very long memory of this kind is suggestive rather than definitive. The mechanisms by which accurate information is preserved or distorted across many generations are not fully understood. But the possibility is real enough to be worth considering, carefully and with appropriate uncertainty, when we try to understand what early humans might have seen and what trace of that seeing, if any, might have survived. Let us go back now, further back than the cave paintings and the Pleistocene megafauna and the first anatomically modern humans. Let us go back to the moment the story of our imagined encounter becomes most vivid, most dreamlike, most genuinely stranger than fiction. Let us go back to the late Cretaceous and stand one more time at the edge of those ancient forests and watch what is coming. The sky above the late Cretaceous world was, in those final years before the asteroid, no different from the sky that had hung over those forests for millions of years. The sun rose and set. The moon moved through its phases. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that would not have been recognizable to modern eyes. The constellations we know today not yet assembled in their current configurations. The stars themselves in slightly different positions in the sky than they will occupy 66 million years hence. But the sky itself was unchanged, blue, enormous, indifferent, occasionally crossed by the enormous slow wings of pterosaurs. In the forests, the ordinary business of life continued. Triceratops grazed in the open areas along river floodplains, moving slowly through the vegetation with the characteristic forward thrust of their massive horned heads. Small mammals, emerging in the brief safety of dawn and dusk from their burrows and nests in the leaf litter, darted after insects with quick, precise movements. Feathered theropods, the small predators of the late Cretaceous, perched in the lower branches of the flowering trees and sang or called in whatever ways they communicated. The rivers ran clear and cold from the uplands, carrying sediment to the lowland deltas that would one day be recorded in rock formations across the western interior of North America. Somewhere in those forests, unheard and unseen, something was approaching. Not a predator, not a competitor, not anything that the living world of the late Cretaceous had any framework for understanding. It was a rock roughly 10 kilometers in diameter, moving at approximately 20 kilometers per second, falling inward from the outer solar system on a trajectory that had been determined by the gravitational interactions of the preceding millions of years. a trajectory that was by this point as fixed and unalterable as anything in the physical universe. It would arrive on a specific date, at a specific location, and nothing in the world it was approaching could have any awareness of what was coming or any power to alter the outcome. The impact, when it came, would be felt as many things in quick succession. First, a flash of light so intense it would have been visible from the other side of the planet. Then, for those close enough to see but not immediately killed, the sky above the impact site would seem to catch fire as the ejected material, vast quantities of vaporized rock, re-entered the atmosphere. Then, rippling outward from the impact site at the speed of sound, a pressure wave that would have flattened forests for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Then, globally, the slow settling of ejecta from the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight, cooling the planet, ending photosynthesis. But we are not going to the moment of impact just yet. We're going to the moment before. We're going to spend some time in those last days and weeks and years, because they matter. Because they represent the full expression of what the world of the dinosaurs was in its final chapter, before the ending came. Because understanding what was lost helps us understand the weight of the question we are asking, helps us feel the magnitude of the 66 million year gap that separates us from that world. In the winter of the last year before the impact, a Tyrannosaurus stood at the edge of a river in what would one day be Montana, and scanned the far bank with those forward-facing eyes. It had been following a small herd of Edmontosaurus for several days, matching their progress along the river, waiting for one of them to become separated or weakened. The hadrosaurs were aware of it. They stayed close together, the adults keeping the younger animals between them, their constant soft vocalizations keeping the group coordinated. The standoff had lasted several days. It would last several more. This is not a scene from a dramatic story. This is a description of what paleontological evidence suggests was an ordinary encounter, a predator-prey dynamic that had been playing out on this floodplain for hundreds of thousands of years. Tyrannosaurus hunting Edmontosaurus. The fossil record of the Hell Creek Formation, which preserves those final million years of the Cretaceous in western North America with extraordinary richness, shows both species in abundance, their bones sometimes found in the same deposits, sometimes showing evidence of the specific interactions between predator and prey in the form of tooth marks on bone and healed injuries in the skeletal remains of hadrosaurs that survived at least one attack. A few kilometers away, a group of Triceratops moved through a dense stand of the new flowering trees, pulling branches down with their beaks and stripping the leaves with a methodical efficiency. They ranged in size from a large adult, perhaps 3 meters at the shoulder and weighing 8 tons, down to a young animal, perhaps a year old, half the adult's height but already carrying the distinctive 3-horned skull in miniature form. The frill of the adult was flushed with colour in the afternoon light, a display that had no audience in the immediate vicinity but may have served as a thermoregulatory function, absorbing heat from the low autumn sun. Small feathered theropods moved through the underbrush nearby, ignoring the Triceratops with the confidence of animals that have nothing to fear from herbivores. They were chasing insects mostly, darting into leaf litter and emerging with beetles or grubs, occasionally making short aerial lunges after flying insects with the rapid wing beats of birds. Their feathers caught the light. Some of them were brightly coloured in patterns that we can only guess at, since feather colour does not preserve in the fossil record, though we have begun to recover chemical signatures from some feathered dinosaur specimens that suggest iridescent blacks and browns in at least some species. In the sky above the forest, a pair of pterosaurs circled on the thermals rising from the sun-heated canopy. They were smaller than the enormous Quetzalcoatlus, but still impressive, with wingspans of perhaps 2 meters, their crested heads held forward as they scanned the ground below for movement. Fish-eaters, probably, these particular species, using the height of the thermal columns to extend their visual range before descending in long, gliding dives toward the river. Their calls, if they made calls in this moment, would have been swallowed by the sound of the wind in the canopy and the constant background noise of the insect world. It is evening now. The light is going golden and low, raking through the trees at an angle that makes the world look as though it is lit from within. The Tyrannosaurus has settled into stillness at the river's edge, conserving energy, waiting. The Triceratops group has moved into denser cover, the adult animals arranging themselves at the periphery of the group in the way that large social herbivores instinctively do as darkness approaches. The small feathered theropods are roosting in the lower branches of the conifers, their feathers fluffed against the cooling air, their heads tucked. The sounds of the forest at dusk in the late Cretaceous would have been extraordinary. The insect chorus, different from the insect chorus of any modern forest but comparable in its layered complexity, would have provided the bass note. The calls of the evening active birds, already diverse by the late Cretaceous, would have overlaid it with something more melodic. And beneath all of that, the low subaudible vibrations of large animals settling into their nighttime positions, the barely heard rumble of a hadrosaur far across the floodplain, the deep exhalation of the Tyrannosaurus at the river's edge, barely distinguishable from the sound of the wind. The stars are coming out. Above the silhouette of the conifers, above the last glow of the western sky, they appear one by one in the darkening blue. These stars, these exact stars, will still be visible 66 million years from now, shifted slightly in their positions but recognizable, burning through the long darkness between now and the moment when the eyes that first look up and wonder at them will finally open. The universe does not know that an ending is coming. The universe does not make those distinctions. But something is coming. Something is already in motion in the darkness between worlds, and the forests below the stars, these warm green forests full of the most extraordinary animals that have ever walked the earth, these forests have perhaps weeks left, perhaps months. Scientists who have studied the terminal Cretaceous sediments most carefully suggest that the impact may have come in late spring or early summer, based on the state of plant growth and animal breeding seasons preserved in the finest geological detail. A spring morning, birds already singing, the new leaves of the flowering trees already out, everything oriented toward growth, toward the future, toward the long warmth of summer ahead. And then the flash, and the fire, and the long silence, but we already know this part. We have already told this part. What we have not yet fully told is what came after the silence, in the long recovery, in the slow rebuilding, in the millions and millions of years during which the world assembled itself into the form that would one day receive the first hesitant footsteps of something new. Something that would one day look back, through the impossible distance of time, and try to imagine what this moment felt like. Something that is, right now, in this quiet night, still trying to imagine it. The asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs was not unusual. That is one of the stranger and more unsettling things about it. It was a rock, a fairly ordinary rock by the standards of the asteroid belt, a chunk of silicate and metal and carbonaceous material that had been orbiting the Sun for billions of years before a gravitational perturbation set it on a new course, one that intersected through pure physical chance with the orbit of the Earth. There was no special malice in it. There was no cosmic significance. It was simply a rock in the wrong place, or the Earth in the wrong place, depending on how you choose to orient your perspective. The asteroid that formed Chicxulub crater was approximately 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter. It hit at an angle of approximately 45 to 60 degrees from the horizontal, striking the shallow carbonate platform of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula at a velocity of roughly 20 kilometers per second. The energy released by the impact has been estimated at somewhere between 100 million and 1 billion megatons of TNT. To put that in perspective, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated by humans released approximately 50 megatons. The Chicxulub impact released at minimum 2 million times more energy, probably considerably more. The immediate effects were localized but devastating on a scale that the word devastating barely touches. Within seconds of impact, a fireball of vaporized rock and water rose through the atmosphere. The shockwave from the impact propagated outward as a magnitude 10 or 11 earthquake, essentially the largest earthquake that has ever occurred in the geologically recent history of the planet. Tsunamis of enormous size radiated outward from the impact site and crossed the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps reaching as far as the western interior seaway of North America and flooding low-lying areas far from the coast. In the forests close to the impact site, in what is now Mexico and Central America and the southern United States, everything was obliterated instantaneously. Nothing survived in the immediate zone, but the effects that would ultimately kill the dinosaurs were not primarily the local effects of the impact. They were the global effects, the injection of enormous quantities of material into the upper atmosphere, material that spread around the entire planet within hours and days, blocking sunlight with an efficiency that no natural event in the preceding tens of millions of years had matched. Imagine the world going dark, not the darkness of night, which is merely a local effect of the Earth's rotation, remedied by the return of the sun every morning. This was darkness global and persistent, the darkness of a sky choked with fine particles of vaporized rock and sulfur aerosols and soot from the continent-spanning fires that followed the initial impact. The kind of darkness in which photosynthesis becomes impossible, in which plants, denied the sunlight they need, begin to die, in which the food chains built on those plants and the food chains built on those food chains begin to unravel from the bottom up. Within weeks, the first signs of collapse would have been visible to any animal capable of noticing them. The plants were not growing. The new leaves that had been unfolding in the warmth of that last spring were not being replaced. The insects that depended on those plants were disappearing. The small animals that depended on insects were starving, and the large herbivores, the great herds of hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, were finding less and less to eat as the vegetation died around them. How long did this darkness last? The models vary depending on the assumptions made about the composition and quantity of the ejecta, but the most widely accepted estimates suggest that the severe light reduction lasted somewhere between 1 and several years. The prolonged impact winter, during which temperatures were significantly depressed below normal, may have lasted a decade or more. The chemical disruption of the atmosphere, including acid rain from sulfur dioxide released by the impact, compounded the damage to vegetation and ocean chemistry over timescales of years to decades. For the large dinosaurs, the ending would have been a slow starvation in a world that was, in every direction, running out of food. Not immediate, not dramatic in the way that popular culture sometimes suggests. The Tyrannosaurus that was watching the hadrosaur herd at the edge of the river in Montana would not have been killed by the impact itself, if it was far enough from the impact site. It would have survived the initial shock, survived the fires, survived the darkness of the first weeks. But then the weeks became months, and the hadrosaurs that had been its prey were dwindling, their own bodies compromised by the loss of vegetation. And the months became years, and the world did not get better. And at some point, in some unnamed place, the last Tyrannosaurus died. Not of fire, not of impact, but of hunger. Of a world that had run out of the food that had sustained its kind for tens of millions of years. This is not a triumphant story. It is a profoundly sad one, if we allow ourselves to feel it that way. These were magnificent animals. They were not failures. They were not victims of their own evolutionary limitations. They were, in many ways, some of the most successful large animals that have ever lived. Creatures that had ruled a planet for 165 million years, that had filled every ecological role available, that had evolved into forms of astonishing diversity and complexity. Their ending was not deserved. It was simply a fact of physics, of the particular configuration of the solar system on a particular day 66 million years ago. But something survived. This is the part of the story that always matters most, because it is the part that leads to us. Something survived the darkness and the cold and the starvation and the acid rain. Small mammals huddled in burrows, eating whatever they could find in the debris-covered world. Birds, the feathered inheritors of the theropod lineage, scratching for seeds in the dead soil. Crocodilians in their rivers, their metabolisms slowed to near zero, surviving on stored fat and whatever fell into the water. Turtles in the mud, frogs beneath the leaf litter. These survivors did not know they were survivors. They did not have any consciousness of what had been lost or any awareness of what would grow from their persistence. They were simply animals, trying to find food in a world that was offering very little of it, trying to stay warm in a world that was colder than it had been, trying to reproduce when the conditions allowed it. The mechanisms of natural selection, indifferent as always to meaning or narrative, simply favoured whatever traits made survival marginally more likely. And from those favoured traits, generation by generation, over millions of years, everything that came next was built. The early Paleocene, the first epoch after the extinction, is preserved in the rock record as one of the most extraordinary transitions in the history of life. Below the boundary layer, the rock is rich with the fossils of the Cretaceous world. Above it, those fossils disappear and are replaced by a completely different fauna, impoverished at first, reduced and simplified, but already showing the first tentative signs of the radiation that would eventually produce the magnificent diversity of the modern world. The boundary layer itself is remarkable. It is a thin band of clay, found at sites all over the world, that is anomalously rich in iridium, an element that is rare in the Earth's crust but relatively common in asteroids. The iridium layer was the first chemical evidence for the impact hypothesis, discovered by the physicist Luis Alvarez and his geologist son Walter in the late 1970s. It was initially controversial, enormously so because the idea that a single asteroid impact had caused one of the great mass extinctions was a dramatic claim, and dramatic claims require extraordinary evidence. But the evidence accumulated. The iridium layer was found on every continent. The impact crater was identified in the Yucatan. The physical and chemical signatures of an enormous impact event were confirmed at dozens of sites worldwide. Today, the impact hypothesis is accepted by essentially all researchers in the field. The asteroid did it. And in the wake of the asteroid, the world rebuilt itself. Slowly at first, then more rapidly, then with the unstoppable momentum of life pouring into emptied ecological spaces. The first 10 million years of the Paleocene were remarkable for the pace of mammalian evolution, for the rapid filling of ecological niches left empty by the dinosaurs' departure. Herbivores evolved to fill the space left by the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians. Carnivores evolved to hunt the herbivores. Omnivores and insectivores diversified into the remaining ecological corners. The world was not the same as it had been before the impact. It was a different world, a cooler world, a world in which mammals rather than reptiles dominated the large animal niches, but it was alive, and getting more alive with every generation. In the forests, the conifers that had survived the impact in reduced numbers were joined by the expanding flowering trees, the angiosperms that had been a minor element of the late Cretaceous landscape, and were now, in the absence of the great dinosaurian herbivores that had been browsing them, free to spread. The radiation of the flowering plants in the Paleocene and Eocene is one of the great stories of plant evolution, the emergence of the rich diversity of flowering trees and shrubs and herbs that today covers most of the Earth's vegetated surface. It was driven partly by the removal of the large herbivores that had been keeping their growth in check, and partly by the coevolution with the new mammalian browsers and the insects and birds that carried pollen and seeds. The sky was changing too. The descendants of the surviving birds were diversifying rapidly into the ecological niches left by the pterosaurs and by the birds that had gone extinct in the impact. Modern bird orders began to appear in the fossil record within a few million years of the extinction event. Waterfowl, shorebirds, owls, parrots and their relatives, the ancestors of the modern songbird order, which would eventually become the most species-rich group of birds in the world. The skies were filling again with flight, with the beat of wings, with the ancient magic of a world that had found a way to put life into the air. All of this, the rebuilding, the radiation, the slow transformation of a devastated world into a new one, took tens of millions of years. And during those tens of millions of years, the ancestors of humans were present in the forests, small-eyed and big-eared and alert in the darkness, eating insects and seeds and small fruits. They were not humans yet. They were not even primates yet. Not quite. But they were there. They were surviving. And they were, generation by generation, with the infinite patience of natural selection, becoming something new. The morning after the impact was not morning in any meaningful sense. The sky above the surviving forest did not lighten at the usual time. What had been dawn was a grey dimness that barely distinguished itself from the darkness before it, a thick and particulate murk that filtered through the upper atmosphere in shades of ochre and brown, casting the world below in a perpetual twilight that had no warmth in it and gave no guidance to the circadian rhythms of the animals that survived. Those animals, the survivors, were already in the process of adapting, not consciously, not intentionally. Evolution does not work intentionally. But the pressure of natural selection, which had always been the background force shaping every living thing on the planet, was now, in the aftermath of the impact, bearing down with particular ferocity on the survivors. Those that could find food in the new conditions survived to reproduce. Those that could not, did not. Those whose immune systems were robust enough to handle the toxins introduced by the impact and the fires survived. Those whose metabolisms were flexible enough to shift between different food sources survived. Those whose reproductive rates were fast enough to build population numbers before their own mortality caught up with them survived. The mammals that made it through the first terrible year were already different from the mammals that had entered that year. Not in any dramatic, visible way. Not in any way that an observer could have identified with certainty, looking at one of these small surviving creatures in its burrow compared to the same species a year before the impact. But in the statistical sense of natural selection, in the sense that the distribution of traits within the surviving population had already shifted, the world had already begun the work of building something new from what remained. The first years after the impact were followed by the first decades, and the first decades by the first centuries. The particulate matter in the upper atmosphere settled slowly. Not quickly enough to end the darkness in any short time frame, but slowly, steadily, the sky began to lighten. The direct sunlight that had not reached the surface of the Earth in full intensity since before the impact began to filter through again, first as a cold, diffuse glow that was not enough to drive vigorous photosynthesis, then, over years, as something more genuinely warm and illuminating. The plants began to respond. The ferns came first, as they usually do after a catastrophic event, because fern spores are extraordinarily resistant and because ferns can grow in the impoverished soils and reduced light of the early aftermath. Geologists have found what they call the fern spike in the rock record immediately above the Chicxulub boundary layer, a dramatic increase in fern spores that marks the moment when photosynthesis began to recover. Behind the ferns came other plants, slowly, tentatively, seeds that had survived the darkness in the soil, in the fur of buried animals, in the guts of creatures that had eaten them before the impact. The angiosperms, those flowering plants whose diversity would eventually transform the world, proved more resilient than the conifers in the immediate aftermath. Their faster generation times, their more flexible root systems, their ability to colonize disturbed ground, all of these gave them an edge in the devastated landscape of the early Paleocene. The conifer forests that had covered so much of the late Cretaceous world would recover, eventually, but the world that emerged from the recovery would be more dominated by flowering plants than the world that had entered the catastrophe. And in the recovering forests the mammals grew, not in size, not yet. The first several million years of the Paleocene produced mammals that were still small by modern standards, the largest approaching the size of a modern beaver or small pig. But they were diversifying with astonishing speed. Different lineages were exploring different ecological strategies. Some were becoming more committed carnivores, developing the elongated canine teeth and blade-like carnassial molars that carnivorous mammals use today. Others were becoming more committed herbivores, developing the grinding molars and complex digestive systems that allow large mammals to extract energy from plant material. Still others were remaining generalists, eating whatever was available, the strategy that had served their ancestors through the extinction and continued to serve them in the uncertain world of the early recovery. Among the small mammals of the early Paleocene were the first primates, or rather, the first primate-like mammals, the ancestors of all primates, in their earliest recognizable form. These were tiny creatures, most of them no larger than a modern squirrel, with grasping feet adapted for moving through trees, forward-facing eyes that gave them the binocular vision useful for judging distances when leaping between branches, and brain-to-body ratios slightly higher than their contemporaries. They were tree-dwellers, fruit and insect eaters, animals that spent most of their lives in the forest canopy, using their enhanced visual acuity and manual dexterity to navigate a three-dimensional environment with precision. The world in which these earliest primates lived was already unrecognizable compared to the Cretaceous. The non-avian dinosaurs were gone, absolutely and completely. There was no geographic region where they survived. There was no isolated island where a small relic population persisted. This is important to say clearly, because it is the established scientific consensus, and it is based on an enormous body of evidence accumulated over decades of research across every continent. The non-avian dinosaurs that had walked the Earth for 165 million years were gone after the Chicxulub impact. What remained were the birds, and the birds were flourishing. But here is something worth thinking about in the early hours of morning, when the mind is soft and the boundaries between the certain and the merely possible feel more permeable than they do in the full light of day. The world of the early Paleocene was large, enormous. Its forests were dense and impenetrable in ways that the managed and fragmented forests of today are not. Its deep oceans were essentially unexplored, as they are today, as they will likely remain for the foreseeable future. The idea that we have a complete inventory of what lived in every corner of the Paleocene world is, of course, false. We have a partial inventory based on an incomplete fossil record. We have guesses, better or worse, about what existed beyond the reach of our sampling. None of this suggests that non-avian dinosaurs survived the extinction, but it does suggest a general epistemic humility about what we know and do not know about the history of life on Earth. The coelacanth, living unchanged in deep water off the coast of Africa for 65 million years without being known to science. The giant squid, a creature of enormous size and remarkable biology, essentially unknown from living specimens until the 20th century. The list of things the world has hidden from us, things we had to stumble across to discover, is longer than most people realize. As millions of years passed after the extinction, the mammalian world continued its extraordinary diversification. The Eocene, the epoch following the Paleocene, saw the emergence of the first true horses, the first true whales, the first bats, the first rodents in anything like their modern form. The primates diversified from their small arboreal ancestors into a variety of forms adapted to different forest environments, different diets, different social structures. By the Middle Eocene, 40 to 50 million years ago, there were primates in Africa, Asia, and North America, animals ranging from small nocturnal insectivores to larger, more visually oriented fruit eaters that were beginning to resemble the monkeys and apes that would come later. The Oligocene brought a cooler climate and the expansion of grasslands as the forest contracted in the drying world. Many of the archaic mammal lineages that had dominated the Eocene were replaced by more modern forms, animals whose anatomy and physiology we would recognize more readily as the ancestors of familiar modern groups. The perissodactyls, the odd-toed ungulates that include horses and rhinoceroses, diversified. The artiodactyls, the even-toed ungulates that include cattle and deer and pigs and hippos and giraffes, began to take over the large herbivore roles. The carnivores of the cat and dog and bear families appeared in recognizable form. And the primates continued their long trajectory. In Africa, the lineage that would produce the great apes was diverging from the monkey lineage, evolving larger brains, more complex social behavior, a more upright posture, and a greater capacity for the kind of flexible, learned behavior that would eventually characterize human cognition. By the late Miocene, roughly 10 million years ago, the earliest members of the hominin lineage, the direct ancestors of humans, were walking upright in East Africa, their hands freed from locomotion to carry things, to make things, to do things that no animal had done before. All of this, the 66 million years of mammalian evolution from small insectivore to upright hominin, happened in the world that the impact had emptied. It happened in the spaces left by the dinosaurs. It happened because the rock had come from space, and the sky had gone dark, and the great reptiles had starved in their dying world, and the small warm mammals had survived in their burrows, and from those survivors had come everything. Everything that breathes and moves in the world today. Every mammal and every bird, every forest and every reef and every river and every relationship between predator and prey and parasite and host in the modern world, all of it is the consequence of that one afternoon in the late spring of a year 66 million years ago. This is not sad ultimately, or it is sad and magnificent simultaneously, in the way that all endings and beginnings are when you can see them clearly. The dinosaurs made way for us, not intentionally, not knowingly, but effectively. The world they had filled was cleared for something new, and that something new, in time, produced creatures that would stand upright and look up at the stars those dinosaurs had never paused to contemplate, and ask questions about the world, and wonder about what had been there before, and sit in the quiet of a late night and try to reach back across 66 million years to touch, however briefly, however imaginatively, the world that had been. We have been travelling for a long time tonight. We have covered 66 million years and several continents. We have walked through the last forest of the dinosaurs and through the dim aftermath of the impact. We have watched the long, patient work of evolution rebuilding a shattered world, and we have followed the line of our own ancestry from small burrowing survivors to upright bipedal hominins to the fully modern humans who stand tonight, wherever you are standing or lying or sitting, and feel the weight of all that history pressing lightly against the back of the mind. It is time now to bring the question fully home, to ask it plainly, without evasion but also without full certainty. What did early humans see? What ancient and extraordinary creatures moved through the world they inhabited? And is there any sense, any genuine sense at all, in which the story of the dinosaurs and the story of the first humans connect? The scientific answer is clear and should be stated clearly. Modern humans evolved approximately 300,000 years ago. The last non-avian dinosaurs lived 66 million years ago. The gap is 65 million, 700,000 years. In that gap, the entire history of primate evolution occurred. In that gap, the continents drifted into their current configurations. In that gap, the climate cycled through ice ages and warm periods. In that gap, the ocean chemistry changed, the atmospheric oxygen levels shifted, the biosphere was restructured multiple times at scales large and small. The idea that any non-avian dinosaur lineage survived that entire gap, persisting in some corner of the world for 65 million years without leaving a fossil trace, without being encountered by any of the many early human populations whose ability to observe and record the natural world was considerable, without leaving any genetic trace in the modern lineages descended from them, is not supported by any credible evidence. But the scientific answer is not the whole answer, because the question itself is not purely a scientific question. The question of what early humans saw is also a question about the human relationship with deep time, about the way we understand our own place in the long history of life, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of a world that is so much older and stranger than our daily experience suggests. And in that broader sense, the answer is considerably richer and more interesting than a simple no. Early humans saw animals that were by any measure extraordinary. They saw woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths and cave lions and megalania and enormous short-faced bears and giant deer and a dozen other species of megafauna that have since gone extinct, many of them within the last 50,000 years, many of them likely as a direct or indirect consequence of human hunting pressure. These animals were extraordinary enough, strange enough, large enough, and dramatic enough to fill the imagination of any observant creature. They did not require supplementing with dinosaurs to constitute a world of remarkable biological wonder. But there is something else that early humans carried, something less tangible than the specific animals they encountered. They carried an inheritance, a biological inheritance that reaches back not just 300,000 years to the first modern humans, not just 6 million years to the first hominins, but all the way back through the primate lineage, through the early mammalian radiations of the Paleocene, through the small survivors of the Cretaceous extinction, to the world that existed when the dinosaurs were alive. That inheritance is written in our DNA, in our physiology, in the shape of our nervous systems. Consider the fear response. Humans, like all mammals, have a deeply wired fear response to certain classes of stimuli. Large, fast-moving objects, snakes and other elongated, scaled creatures, spiders, predators with forward-facing eyes. These fears are not cultural inventions. They are partially innate, encoded in the architecture of the brain, present in some form in infants, before they have had any direct experience that could have produced them through learning. The fear of snakes, in particular, has been shown to have a partial genetic basis, with specific neural pathways dedicated to the rapid, precognitive detection of snake-like shapes in the visual field. Where do these fears come from? They come from the long history of selective pressure, from the millions and millions of years during which the ancestors of mammals lived in environments where snakes, spiders, and large predators were genuine threats that had to be responded to instantly and automatically. The small insectivore that hesitated when it detected the movement of a snake at the edge of its burrow was less likely to survive than the one that flinched away before it had time to think. The fear response, instantaneous and pre-rational, was an adaptation. It was written into the mammalian nervous system so deep and so long ago that it persists today in animals that have had no recent evolutionary history with the predators that originally shaped it. And in the deep past of that selective pressure, in the very foundation layers of the mammalian fear architecture, there is a stratum that predates any human ancestor by tens of millions of years. There is a layer that was laid down in the world of the late Cretaceous, in the forests that Tyrannosaurus walked through. The early mammals that cowered in their burrows while the ground shook with the footsteps of a large theropod. Those animals were our ancestors. Their response to that threat, the freezing and the hiding and the small body and the nocturnal habits, was part of what got them through. And the neural architecture that shaped that response is in a very real sense, still with us. This is not a mystical claim. It is a straightforward claim about evolutionary inheritance. The human brain carries, in its deepest and most primitive structures, the legacy of a world that ended 66 million years ago. We do not remember the dinosaurs consciously, we cannot. But the shape of our fear, the specific contours of the anxiety that a large predatory reptile produces in a human nervous system, the way the sight of a very large snake or a Komodo dragon or a saltwater crocodile triggers a response that seems disproportionate to the actual level of threat. In a modern context, all of this has roots that go deep into the Mesozoic. There is a theory in evolutionary psychology, sometimes called the savanna hypothesis or the biophilia hypothesis, that proposes that human aesthetic preferences for certain landscapes, for the open parkland with scattered trees, the broad view with water visible in the distance, are a legacy of our evolutionary history on the African savanna. We are attracted to environments that offered our ancestors food, safety and visibility, because those preferences were adaptive. The aesthetics encoded in our nervous systems are in part the aesthetics of survival. We find beautiful what was useful to be attracted to. If this is true, then perhaps something similar applies to the deep time content of our imaginations. The monsters of human mythology, the dragons and serpents and giant beasts that appear in the stories of virtually every culture, are not random inventions. They are not pure fantasy with no referent in reality. They draw on something. They draw on the accumulated experience of living creatures that have been encountering large, dangerous reptiles and other formidable animals for hundreds of millions of years. The dragon, in its many cultural forms, draws on the visual and behavioral vocabulary of the large reptile, on the scales and the cold eyes and the patience of the ambush hunter, on the ancient terror of something that is simultaneously familiar and completely alien. We cannot say with certainty that the dragon myth is a memory of the dinosaurs. That claim would require a chain of cultural transmission so long and so accurately preserved that it is essentially impossible to verify. But we can say that the dragon draws on something real and ancient, on a relationship between mammal and large reptile that is as old as the mammals themselves, on a fear that was written into the nervous system long before the first human story was ever told. And so, in a sense that is not literal but is not entirely metaphorical either. Early humans did carry the dinosaurs with them. They carried them in their fear responses and their dreams and their stories. They carried them in the shape of the attention they paid to large reptiles and in the particular quality of the unease that crocodiles and large lizards produced in their nervous systems. They carried them in the architecture of the brain structures that had been shaped, in part, by the world that the dinosaurs had created and dominated and finally left behind. This is what we mean when we say that the story of the dinosaurs does not end with the extinction. It does not end with the asteroid and the darkness and the silence. It continues, in reduced form, in changed form, in the form of inheritance and echo, and the deep imprinting of a world on the nervous systems of the creatures that survived it. It continues in the bones of crocodilians lying in the mud of African rivers, unchanged in their basic design for 100 million years. It continues in the birds that sing outside your window, the direct and literal descendants of those feathered Cretaceous theropods, carrying in their hollow bones and air sacs and sharp eyes and musical intelligence the legacy of a lineage older than any mammal. It continues in you, in the particular way the mind travels when it is released from the duties of the day and allowed to move freely through the dark and the quiet, the way it reaches back, without knowing quite what it is reaching for, towards something older and stranger and more magnificent than anything in the lived daily experience. The fascination with dinosaurs that most children feel, and that many adults never quite lose, is not a culturally constructed phenomenon. It is not merely the result of movies and museum exhibits, though those certainly amplify it. It is something older. It is the recognition, somewhere below the level of articulate thought, of a kinship that is real, even though it reaches across 66 million years. We are the descendants of animals that lived alongside the dinosaurs, that were shaped by the world the dinosaurs created, that survived because of strategies and traits developed in response to the pressure of that world. The early humans who walked through the forests of Pleistocene Africa and Europe did not see non-avian dinosaurs. The mathematics are clear and the evidence is settled. But they walked through a world that still contained the living echoes of the dinosaur age, that was filled with animals whose evolutionary lineages reached back through the Cretaceous and beyond. They walked through a world that their own bodies remembered, at the level of instinct and reflex and the deep grammar of fear and wonder, as a world shaped by giants. And in the stories they told around fires that burned in the darkness of 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, something of that memory persisted, not as accurate documentary record, not as eyewitness testimony, but as something more fundamental and more durable, as the template for the great story, the story that every human culture tells in one form or another, the story of the world before, of the great creatures that walk the earth before the age of humans, of the powers and presences that still move through the deep places of the world where our kind has not yet fully penetrated. That story is not false. It is, in its deeper structure, one of the most accurate things the human imagination has ever produced. There was a world before us. It was stranger and larger and more magnificent than we have yet fully imagined. Its ending made room for our beginning, and something of it is still with us, will always be with us, in the shape of our fears and the content of our dreams, and the particular quality of the awe that descends when we stand in front of the skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus and feel, in the most primitive and reliable part of the nervous system, the recognition of something deeply, distantly, irreversibly familiar. The night is deep now. The questions have been asked and turned over and set gently aside. The images are still moving at the edges of thought, those forests and those rivers, and those enormous shadows passing through the columns of ancient light. Let them drift. Let the mind follow them as far as it will go and then let go. The story has been told. The long journey through time is complete. What remains now is the quiet and the dark and the slow, easy breathing of a mind settling into rest. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Before you drift off, here is a question for the comments. If you could spend 1 hour in any prehistoric era, from the Cambrian oceans to the last forests of the Cretaceous, which would you choose? And what is the one creature you would most want to see? Leave your answer below. The answers always surprise me. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is beneath you. Notice your breathing. It is slow. It has been slowing for a long time now, carried along by the rhythm of the story, by the ancient and reliable cadence of one word following another in the dark. You are here, in this moment, in this particular body, on this particular planet, because of a sequence of events 66 million years long. Because a rock came from the sky, and small creatures survived in their burrows, and the world rebuilt itself, and the primates climbed the trees of the recovering forests, and the hominins came down from those trees and stood upright, and looked at the horizon, and eventually, through a lineage so long that it cannot be fully traced, became you. You carry the ancient world in your bones and in your blood. You carry the memory of forests that no longer exist and creatures that no longer breathe. You carry something that is 66 million years older than anything you will do tomorrow. Let that be a comfort tonight. Let the weight of deep time hold you as gently as the ground holds you. The world has been here for a very long time. It will be here tomorrow. Sleep well. Dream of ancient rains and ancient forests, and the sound of enormous animals moving through the dark. You are safe here. You have always been safe here. Good night. Good night. Dream well. The ancient world is watching over you in the way that only 66 million years of unbroken inheritance can watch over anything. Without awareness, without intention, but with the undeniable weight of everything that survived to make you possible. Rest in that weight. Let it hold you until morning. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.